Hey guys, tonight we are wandering into the kitchens, markets, and banquet halls of ancient Persia, a place where the smells of spiced stews, the crunch of flatbreads, and the soft sweetness of dates filled the air of daily life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough right now, leave a quick comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in the middle of a Persian marketplace, sometime around 500 BCE, during the reign of Darius the Great. The air is thick with desert heat, but shaded awnings keep the traders cool. To your left, baskets overflow with pistachios and walnuts, each pile carefully measured by the merchant with a set of bronze weights. To your right, a stall sells nothing but dates, so fresh that they nearly burst with syrup when pressed between the fingers. A donkey brays somewhere behind you, irritated at the weight, while a woman with clay jars negotiates for oil pressed from sesame seeds. The scene is not one of luxury for most people. It is the hum of daily life, where every calorie mattered, and where food was as much a reflection of empire as it was a necessity. The Persian Empire was vast, stretching from the Indus Valley in the east to the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west. This meant that the foods available to an ordinary Persian were not confined to one small region. Instead, the empire functioned like a pantry stocked with goods gathered from a dozen climates. Rice grew in the eastern provinces, barley was common across Mesopotamia, and wheat was brought in from regions near Anatolia. What you ate in Persia depended not just on your class, but also on the supply routes feeding your town. The empire's road system, the royal road being the most famous, allowed foods to travel farther than most people ever would. For peasants, the backbone of the diet was barley bread, baked flat on hot stones or slapped against the sides of a clay oven. The bread was chewy, filling, and endlessly versatile. With it came simple stews, lentils boiled with onions, chickpeas flavored with herbs, or barley soups thickened with a handful of greens picked from the garden. If you were lucky enough to own sheep or goats, milk could be fermented into yogurt, a tangy addition that provided much needed protein. Cheese, pressed into hard rounds, could last through the winter when fresh milk was scarce. Yet food in Persia was not just about survival. It was about status. At court banquets, where kings entertained visiting dignitaries or celebrated military victories, the scale of meals was staggering. Ancient Greek historians, who loved to remark on Persian habits, recorded that entire herds of animals were consumed at a single gathering. Sheep, goats, and cattle were roasted or stewed, while birds, pheasants, partridges, even peacocks, were prepared for the tables of the wealthy. Such feasts were not only indulgence, they were theatre, proof of the empire's abundance and power. For a visiting ambassador, the sheer volume of food was meant to leave an impression as lasting as the words of the king. And then there were the flavors. Persia sat at the heart of ancient spice routes, and though not every household could afford them, cinnamon, cardamom, and cloves made their way into the kitchens of nobles. More common were herbs grown locally: dill, mint, coriander, and fenugreek. Garlic and onions, staples of nearly every cuisine in the ancient world, were cheap and widely used, not only to flavor stews but also as medicine. Imagine biting into a warm piece of barley bread, dipped into a stew spiced with coriander, flecked with mint, and softened by yogurt. The taste was simple, but for people of the time, it was deeply satisfying. Drinks tell their own story. While water from wells or rivers was the daily beverage, wine held pride of place in Persian culture. Vineyards flourished in many parts of the empire, and wine was often sweetened with honey or flavored with herbs. Herodotus, writing with a mixture of admiration and disdain, claimed that Persians made important decisions while drunk, and then reconsidered them the next day while sober, only adopting a plan if it passed both tests. Whether or not that was true, it speaks to how closely wine was tied to ideas of leisure, decision-making, and ritual. For those who could not afford wine, Fermented barley drinks, something between a beer and a thin porridge, served the same purpose. If you were traveling across the empire, your meals would have reflected the terrain. Along the Persian Gulf, fish and shellfish were common, while in the highlands of Iran, dried fruits and nuts were carried as travel food. Soldiers on campaign often subsisted on a mixture of dried meat, flatbread, and dates, washed down with whatever local drink could be acquired. It was not glamorous, but it was fuel for marching across continents. The empire's administrators made sure that garrisons and travelers along the royal road had supplies, including grain stored in granaries that could be distributed when needed. Meals were also social markers. To be invited to a nobleman's home for dinner was more than hospitality. It was an acknowledgement of status. Guests reclined on couches, leaning on one arm, while servants brought dishes to them in a sequence designed to impress. There was no rushing through a meal. It unfolded slowly, punctuated with conversation, poetry, or music. Eating together was a form of bonding, of creating obligations and alliances. Even the arrangement of food, who received the best cuts, who sat closest to the host, spoke volumes about hierarchy. But while nobles dined on luxuries, what of the laborers who built the empire's palaces, canals, archaeological finds from Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, offer clues. Clay tablets, used for administrative records, show that workers were often paid in rations rather than money. These included barley, beer, and sometimes meat or dates. Women received smaller rations than men, though they were often employed in weaving workshops that supplied the empire with textiles. Children, too, were listed in the records, their daily sustenance carefully measured. Food was not just a matter of taste. It was a form of currency, a way of structuring society. Religious practice also touched the dinner table. Zoroastrianism, the faith most closely associated with ancient Persia, held fire as sacred and emphasized ritual purity. While the religion did not forbid eating meat, it placed importance on how animals were slaughtered and how food was prepared. Certain feasts marked the turning of the seasons, during which offerings of bread, milk, and fruits were made to the gods. To eat was to participate not just in survival, but in the rhythms of cosmic order. If you were to walk through the back alleys of a Persian town at dusk, you might catch glimpses of daily dinners. Families gathered around low tables, children squabbling over the last piece of bread. The smell of onions sizzling in oil drifted from clay ovens, while neighbors passed by carrying bowls of stew wrapped in cloth to keep them warm. Dogs lingered hopefully at the edges of gatherings, waiting for scraps. Somewhere, in a richer household, musicians tuned their instruments as servants set out trays of roasted lamb, fragrant rice, and sweet desserts made with honey and sesame. Even dessert had its place. Simple sweets included dates stuffed with nuts, sesame candies hardened with syrup, and fruits preserved in honey. For the wealthy, imported delicacies, apricots from Central Asia or citrus fruits from India, offered both novelty and prestige. To taste something rare was to taste empire itself, a reminder of just how far Persian influence stretched. Food linked the empire's past with its future. The Persians inherited agricultural practices from earlier Mesopotamian civilizations, but adapted them to new lands. They built qanats, underground irrigation channels, that allowed fields to bloom even in arid regions. These innovations ensured a steady food supply, sustaining both soldiers and citizens. Without such systems, the empire could not have held together across such diverse and challenging landscapes. As night falls in your imagined Persian town, lamps flicker to life, casting golden circles of light onto stone courtyards. The day's work is done. The markets closed, the streets quieter. Inside homes, meals wind down with cups of wine, the laughter of family, and perhaps the soft recitation of a poem. For a moment, across the vast empire, people rich and poor share a single truth: they eat, they drink, and they rest, ready for another day in the rhythms of life that bound the Persian world together. But here is where the curiosity lingers. With all of this abundance, from barley fields to elaborate banquets, what happened when food supplies failed? What did Persians do when drought struck, or when supply lines faltered? Imagine the Persian Empire again, but not during its prosperous feasts or bustling markets. Instead, picture a year when the rains failed, fields once green, with barley turned yellow and brittle. Qanats, those underground irrigation channels so carefully engineered, ran dry or delivered only a trickle. When this happened, the abundance of Persia faced its greatest test. For all the glory of banquets and the richness of trade routes, food insecurity was a shadow that stretched across the empire, waiting to emerge whenever climate, war, or mismanagement disrupted the balance. The Persians were not strangers to famine. Evidence from clay records, administrative tablets, and the observations of outside chroniclers reveal moments when hunger forced people to change what they ate and how they lived. The empire's administrators had a vast responsibility to keep granaries stocked, to ensure that food could be redistributed when needed, and to manage supply lines across thousands of kilometers of territory. This was not easy. A caravan of donkeys carrying grain from Babylon to Persepolis might take weeks, and each animal consumed part of the very supply it carried. Yet the Persians were known for their system of satrapies, or provinces, each governed with a degree of autonomy, but linked by the responsibility to supply tribute and taxes, often in the form of food. When scarcity struck, the burden was not shared equally. The royal court and noble households almost always had enough to eat. Their granaries, stocked with years of reserves, could buffer the effects of bad harvests. For the ordinary farmer, however, the margin between plenty and hunger was slim. A failed barley crop could mean thinning out stews, stretching bread dough with less flour, or turning more heavily to wild foods. Foraging became a necessity. Wild herbs, edible roots, and whatever fruits the season still offered. Some scholars suggest that the spread of pomegranate orchards, for instance, was not only for taste, but as a resilient food that could endure dry years better than grain fields. Yet famine in Persia rarely reached the catastrophic levels recorded in some other parts of the ancient world. The empire's strength lay in its diversity of climates. A drought in one region could sometimes be offset by surplus in another. This is where the famous royal road once again played a part. Couriers and administrators could coordinate the movement of food from satrapy to satrapy, smoothing out the bumps of local scarcity. It was, in a sense, an early form of food security management, but it was not perfect. If multiple regions suffered together, or if war disrupted trade, hunger spread. The rituals surrounding food also revealed a people constantly aware of its fragility. During religious festivals tied to Zoroastrianism, offerings of bread and milk were made to divine forces, asking for prosperity in the coming year. Fires were tended with care, prayers recited, and meals shared communally. These were not grand banquets. They were careful acknowledgements that life depended on forces beyond human control. When drought loomed, the weight of those prayers became heavier, meals became more symbolic, and the smallest foods could carry great meaning. In moments of shortage, what happened to daily meals? Consider the soldier's ration again. When times were good, he received bread, dried fruits, and sometimes meat. When times were lean, rations shrank. Dried bread, dipped in water or wine, became a meal. A thin gruel of barley might replace stews that once brimmed with lentils and onions. Hunger was felt first in the thinning of flavors. Spices omitted, herbs absent, meat no longer available. The body felt the loss long before the stomach was entirely empty. Children and women bore the brunt of these shortages. Administrative records show that their rations were already smaller during good times. In lean years, these allocations shrank even further, leaving the most vulnerable members of society at risk. And yet, within households, there may have been small acts of care. Parents giving their share to children, neighbors sharing what little they had. The survival of communities often depended not just on empire-wide logistics, but on the quiet generosity of ordinary people. In wealthier circles, food shortages did not necessarily lead to hunger, but they did lead to substitution. If wheat bread grew scarce, barley bread took its place. If meat was harder to find, more reliance was placed on dairy and eggs. The ingenuity of cooks mattered. Recipes adapted and banquets, though still impressive, might feature dishes designed to stretch ingredients further. A large stew flavored with herbs could disguise the absence of a rich cut of meat, while dried fruits could be rehydrated into compotes that seemed lavish even when supplies were tight. And so, food shortages shaped Persian culture in subtle ways. They reinforced the importance of the empire's administrative system. They highlighted the role of the satraps in ensuring loyalty, not just with soldiers, but with food security. They gave religious festivals a sharper edge of urgency, and they sharpened the divide between the privileged and the poor. To imagine yourself as a farmer during these years is to feel the quiet anxiety that every season might fail, and that your meals tomorrow depended on rains you could not control. But hunger was not the only challenge in Persia's food history. Another was etiquette, the rules of how and when food should be eaten. To an outsider, Persian dining customs could appear elaborate, even puzzling. The reclining posture at banquets, for example, was not just comfort. It was a signal of status and relaxation, a way of saying that one had the leisure to eat slowly. Servants delivered food in measured courses, and guests used their right hands to eat, leaving the left hand for less cleanly tasks. These customs made meals into performances. At the same time, there were rules about what one should not do at the table. To eat greedily, to talk with food in one's mouth, or to reach across another guest's portion was frowned upon. Persian etiquette valued composure and restraint. Food was not just fuel, it was a mirror of character. To eat calmly, to share generously, to appreciate flavors without excess. These were qualities admired in noble households. This is why Greek writers, often keen to criticize Persians, described their meals with both fascination and disdain. They mocked what they saw as excess, yet they could not deny the refinement of Persian banquets. To them, Persia was a land of contradictions, an empire of conquerors, who also elevated the art of hospitality. A guest could be overwhelmed by the sheer scale of a feast, but just as important was the choreography of how food was offered and accepted. If you imagine yourself at one of these meals, reclining on a couch, you might first be offered bread, not a whole loaf, but pieces torn for you by a servant. Then would come small dishes, nuts, olives, dried fruits. Next, stews of lamb or goat, flavored with mint and garlic, served in shallow bowls. Wine flowed steadily, diluted with water to make it last longer, though not so weak as to remove its effect. Music floated in the background, perhaps the strumming of a lute-like instrument, while conversations wove around you. For the Persians, this act of eating together was an extension of governance. To host well was to lead well. A king's ability to provide food in abundance and in order mirrored his ability to rule the empire. Hospitality was not a private virtue, it was a political act. To fail at it was to signal weakness. To excel at it was to reinforce power. And yet, even amidst this refinement, daily meals for ordinary Persians continued in their simplicity. A farmer might return from the fields, wash the dust from his hands, and sit with his family around a modest table. Bread, cheese, onions, and perhaps a small bowl of yogurt formed the evening's fare. The hum of crickets filled the air, children grew drowsy, and life carried on in quiet rhythms. Compared to the courtly banquets, these meals might seem unremarkable, but they were the foundation of society. Without them, no empire could stand. The contrast between feast and famine, between banquet etiquette and peasant rations, illustrates the spectrum of Persian eating habits. Food was never neutral. It was shaped by geography, by politics, by climate, and by custom. It was both survival and symbol. To trace what Persians ate is to trace the empire itself, its strengths, its vulnerabilities, and its constant balancing act between plenty and want. Still, one question lingers as we close this part of the story. What did all this mean for cultural exchange? With such a vast empire, stretching across so many lands, how did the foods of one region transform the diets of another? What happened when Egyptian lentils met Indian spices on Persian tables, or when Greek olives mixed with Mesopotamian dates? If you follow the trails of Persian food across the empire, you discover not just meals but cultural bridges. Every bite was a meeting place of regions and peoples. When the Persians expanded their rule under Cyrus the Great and later kings, they did not erase local traditions. Instead, they often absorbed them, allowing each province to keep its ways of cooking while contributing ingredients and dishes to the broader Persian table. Take Egypt, for instance. After its conquest by Cambyses Su, Egyptian grains, particularly wheat, entered Persian distribution systems. Wheat bread, softer and lighter than barley bread, found its way into noble homes. Egyptian onions and leeks also became staples of Persian stews. From the Indus Valley, rice was introduced, and though it was not immediately common across all of Persia, it gradually became more significant in eastern provinces. Meanwhile, from Anatolia came olives and olive oil, adding richness to meals and variety to cooking methods. Persian banquets soon became a microcosm of the empire itself. You could sit at a table in Persepolis and taste apricots from Central Asia, wine from the Caucasus, fish from the Persian Gulf, and grains grown along the Euphrates. Each dish whispered of a faraway land brought into the orbit of Persian rule. The empire's diversity was edible, one of its most tangible expressions of power. This exchange did not flow only one way. Persian irrigation techniques, such as the Khanat system, spread into new territories, changing how food was grown. Techniques for preserving fruits and nuts traveled with merchants and administrators, becoming part of other cultures' culinary repertoires. Even dining customs, the reclining posture, the rhythm of multiple courses, the prominence of wine, spread westward, influencing later Greek and Roman habits. But food exchange also highlighted differences. Not everyone adopted Persian tastes. Some subject peoples clung tightly to their local cuisines, using food as a quiet act of identity. To eat in one's traditional way was to resist assimilation, even while under Persian authority. Thus, a Phoenician family might continue to rely heavily on fish and coastal herbs, while a Babylonian household still baked breads marked by their own regional styles. The empire allowed for this diversity, but at banquets and official gatherings, Persian norms prevailed. Another layer to consider is medicine. In Persia, as in much of the ancient world, food and medicine blurred together. Physicians prescribed diets as cures. Garlic was recommended for digestion, yogurt for cooling fevers, pomegranates for cleansing the blood. Honey, used as both sweetener and antiseptic, was valued for its healing properties. A Persian suffering from stomach troubles might be told to eat mint with his bread, while someone fatigued from travel might be encouraged to drink a mixture of wine and herbs. To eat was, in a sense, to heal. Daily cooking practices reveal yet more detail. Archaeological finds of grinding stones, ovens, and pottery suggest how food was prepared. Grain was ground into flour with hand-operated querns, then baked into flatbreads against the walls of clay ovens. Meat was boiled in large pots, producing stews that could stretch across multiple meals. Herbs were tied in bundles and hung to dry, filling kitchens with their scent. Cooking was often communal. In villages, women gathered to bake bread together, sharing ovens and labor. Meals were thus not just private events but woven into the social fabric. For children, food education began early. Boys and girls learned how to shape dough, milk goats, or gather herbs. Food was a teacher of discipline, patience, and cooperation. Festivals provided moments of indulgence when children tasted sweets or received larger portions. These moments stood out in memory as rare delights against the backdrop of everyday repetition. And repetition was indeed the heart of Persian eating. Most meals were not grand, nor even varied. Bread, dairy, pulses, and herbs carried families through the week. Banquets and imported luxuries, while dazzling, were rare for the majority. To understand Persia's food history is to recognize how much of life was ordinary, how often people ate the same things day after day, and how those simple staples underpinned the extraordinary feats of empire. What, then, was the legacy of Persian food? On one level, it was survival, keeping soldiers marching, workers building, families nourished. On another, it was cultural transmission. Later Islamic cuisines inherited many Persian elements: the use of yogurt, the prominence of herbs, the pairing of sweet and savory. The Persian love of rice dishes would evolve into the pilafs and biryanis of later centuries. Even today, in Iranian cuisine, echoes of the ancient past remain. Flatbreads, herb stews, yogurt sauces, and the central role of hospitality. But perhaps the deepest legacy lies in the Persian idea that food was inseparable from empire. To rule was to feed, to host, to provide abundance. A famine was not just a natural disaster, but a political failure. A banquet was not just a party, but a statement of authority. Food was the empire in miniature, diverse, abundant, ordered, and meant to impress. And so, if you imagine sitting down in an ordinary Persian household at dusk, or reclining at a king's feast, or eating a soldier's ration along a dusty road, you are tasting more than food. You are tasting empire itself, the anxieties of scarcity, the pride of abundance, the blend of cultures under one rule. As you finish your imagined meal, bread dipped in stew, wine diluted with water, perhaps a sweet date to close, you might reflect on how much has changed and how much has not. Meals still gather people together. Food still expresses identity. Scarcity still tests societies, and abundance still dazzles. So, when you ask, how did people eat in ancient Persia? The answer stretches beyond the plate. They ate with the rhythms of empire, with the memory of famine, with the hope of abundance, and with the awareness that every meal was both ordinary and extraordinary. And it leaves one final question to linger in your mind as you drift off. When future historians look back at our own eating habits, what will they see, not just on the table, but in the empires of our time? Imagine yourself traveling across the Silk Roads, sometime in the first centuries of their flourishing. The road beneath your feet is not one single road, but a network of paths winding from China through Central Asia, Persia, and into the Mediterranean. Traders, pilgrims, soldiers, and envoys move along these dusty arteries, carrying silk, spices, gems, and stories. Yet for all the grandeur associated with the Silk Roads, much of the experience for travelers was marked by the most ordinary of concerns: where to sleep, what to eat, and how to keep safe at night. The caravanserai, or roadside inn, was the answer. These structures dotted the routes at intervals of roughly 20 to 30 miles, the distance a caravan could reasonably travel in a day. Their forgotten walls, many now reduced to ruins across Central Asia and Iran, once provided shelter, rest, and exchange. Without them, the Silk Roads would have been nearly impassable for large numbers of travelers. Yet they are rarely remembered in detail. They are the quiet infrastructure behind one of history's most famous trade systems. Approaching a caravanserai after a long day of travel, the first thing a traveler might notice was the massive gateway. Built with thick walls of stone or baked brick, the structures resembled small fortresses. Indeed, that was part of their purpose, to guard against bandits, wolves, and the desert itself. The gates were often tall enough for camels to pass through fully laden, and they swung shut at night to keep danger at bay. Once inside, the noise and bustle of the road gave way to a different rhythm. The practical routines of lodging dozens of travelers and animals under one roof. The central courtyard was the heart of the caravanserai. Around it ran arched galleries and rooms where guests could sleep. Some were simple chambers with straw mats. Others were larger halls where groups might rest together. In the center of the courtyard, troves for animals and sometimes a well provided water. Fires were lit for cooking, and the air filled with the mingled scents of stewing lentils, roasting meat, and smoke from dung fueled flames. The life of the road condensed here in miniature, as people from distant lands shared the same space for a night. Meals were not lavish but practical. Inns might offer barley bread, lentil stews, or dried fruits, though many travelers cooked their own provisions. Merchants unwrapped bundles of dried apricots or figs, soldiers chewed on strips of cured meat, and pilgrims might subsist on nuts and flatbread. Water was precious. Wine or fermented milk drinks supplemented hydration when clean wells were scarce. Imagine yourself sitting cross-legged in the courtyard, dipping bread into a communal bowl of stew while listening to conversations in tongues you barely understood. Sogdian, Persian, Chinese, Arabic, Greek. The caravanserai was not just a resting place, it was a crossroads of cultures. News traveled here faster than silk. Stories of distant emperors, new trade routes, wars, and rumors of bandits spread around evening fires. Languages mixed, goods were compared, and friendships or rivalries began. A Chinese trader might first taste pistachios in such an inn, while a Persian merchant encountered tea for the first time. These inns were classrooms of the road, places where knowledge exchanged hands as surely as coins. Security was always on travelers' minds. Outside the caravanserai walls, bandits lurked. Wolves could descend upon livestock. Even within, tempers flared. Merchants wary of theft kept a close watch on their goods, sometimes sleeping beside their camels for safety. Innkeepers acted as informal arbiters of disputes, though their primary role was more practical, to maintain the gates, to collect small fees or tributes, and to ensure the place remained functional. Their work was rarely celebrated, but without it, the road would have faltered. These structures varied in quality. Some were sturdy, well kept, with fresh water and clean spaces. Others were little more than crumbling shelters, drafty and cold in the winter, sweltering in the summer. A traveller's comfort depended as much on luck as on planning. Yet even the poorest inn offered something invaluable, a break from exposure, a chance to gather strength for the next day's journey. As the sun set, the caravanserai shifted into nighttime rhythms. Lamps flickered in niches along the walls, casting uneven pools of light. Animals settled into stalls, their noises a constant backdrop. Travelers spread their bedding, unrolled mats, or pulled cloaks tighter around themselves. Conversations gave way to snores, interrupted only by the creak of a gate or the call of a night watchman. For all its bustle, the inn could be a place of deep rest, where exhaustion dulled the discomfort of straw bedding and rough stone walls. But beyond these daily routines, the caravanserai held symbolic importance. It represented the reach of empire, the attempt of rulers to impose order on vast distances. Kings and caliphs invested in building them, aware that trade and communication depended on such infrastructure. To provide safety and rest was not just generosity, it was governance. The forgotten inns were, in a quiet way, instruments of empire. And yet, for all their importance, the daily details of life within them often go unrecorded. What exactly did the meals taste like? How did strangers negotiate space in cramped quarters? What did it feel like to hear a dozen languages in one courtyard, all competing with the crackle of firewood and the lowing of animals? The traces we have are scattered, glimpsed through travelogues, ruins, and stray references in administrative texts. The full richness of caravanserai life remains partly hidden, waiting for us to imagine from fragments. Which leads to the next question. What happened inside these inns when trade was booming, when caravans stretched for miles and the flow of goods seemed endless? How did prosperity shape the rhythms of the caravanserai, and what luxuries or tensions arose in times of abundance? Picture the Silk Roads during one of their high points of prosperity, perhaps in the 7th or 8th century, when caravans stretched so long that their dust clouds could be seen on the horizon before the camels themselves came into view. This was the age when Chinese silk flowed steadily westward, Roman and later Byzantine coins trickled eastward, and spices, gems, glass, and manuscripts changed hands at every stage in between. At such times, caravanserais did not simply serve as shelters. They became thriving microcosms of commerce and culture. A prosperous caravanserai could feel like a bustling town in miniature. By day, the courtyard rang with the shouts of merchants calling to their animals, servants unloading bales of silk, and innkeepers negotiating fees. The architecture reflected this importance, heavy gates framed by intricate brickwork, domed ceilings that echoed voices, and sometimes even inscriptions carved into stone to commemorate the rulers who funded their construction. A grand caravanserai was a symbol of stability and wealth, reminding travelers that the empire or kingdom through which they passed was strong enough to protect trade. Inside, the food became more varied in prosperous times. Inns often employed cooks who specialized in serving large groups. Rather than relying solely on travelers' own supplies, guests might order meals prepared on site. Lamb stewed with garlic and herbs, skewers of meat grilled over open flames, bowls of rice flavored with saffron or turmeric were available. For dessert, dried figs and apricots stewed with honey offered sweetness at the end of a long day. The smell of roasted meat wafted through the courtyards, mingling with the sharper scent of vinegar, the earthy odor of animals, and the smoke of dung fueled fires. Prosperity also meant trade within the inn itself. Courtyards doubled as temporary markets where travelers exchanged goods, sometimes even before reaching official bazaars in the cities. A Persian trader might sell surplus dates to a Chinese merchant, who in turn bartered silk for a pouch of Central Asian gemstones. Transactions were not limited to physical goods. Knowledge about routes, political shifts, or the price of spices was perhaps the most valuable currency exchanged. A single rumor whispered by firelight could alter a merchant's strategy for the months ahead. In such an environment, languages became tools of survival. Sogdian traders, renowned as the intermediaries of the Silk Roads, often served as interpreters between Chinese, Persian, and Turkic speakers. To walk through a caravanserai was to overhear a polyglot world greetings in Arabic, bargaining in Persian, laughter in Turkic, and solemn prayers in Sanskrit or Chinese. For many travelers, these inns provided their first exposure to foreign tongues, foreign clothing, and foreign habits, which could inspire both curiosity and suspicion. Luxury also filtered into the caravanserais. Wealthy merchants sometimes traveled with personal servants who set up more comfortable quarters inside the inn. Cushions, carpets, and blankets softened the hard stone floors. Meals might be accompanied by fine wine, carried in ceramic jars, or by delicacies bought in the nearest city and shared among trusted companions. In some places, entertainers, musicians, storytellers, or dancers performed in the evenings, turning the inn into a stage. For a wary merchant who had trudged across the desert, such comforts marked a stark contrast to the dust and danger of the open road. Yet prosperity carried its own tensions. With more wealth came greater risk of theft. Caravanserais, though built like fortresses, were not immune to crime. Petty theft of coins, food, or cloth was common, and innkeepers were tasked with keeping order. Locks, guards, and watchmen helped, but suspicion often simmered. Merchants might sleep with their goods piled close, a hand resting on a dagger or staff, their ears attuned to any strange sound in the night. Religious diversity, too, found expression in these inns. Travelers carried their faiths with them, and while inns did not always have dedicated chapels or temples, guests found ways to practice. A Buddhist monk might quietly unroll a scroll for evening recitation, while a Muslim trader performed his prayers facing west. Zoroastrians tended small fires in portable braziers, while Christians carried icons or crosses as reminders of their faith. In a single courtyard, these practices unfolded side by side, not always harmoniously, but often with a pragmatic tolerance born of necessity. The road was too dangerous to quarrel endlessly. Survival required coexistence. The economic role of caravanserais expanded as well. They became hubs for tax collection, where rulers stationed officials to inspect goods, levy duties, and ensure that trade enriched the treasury. Some inns functioned almost like customs houses, where merchants presented their wares for inspection before continuing their journeys. Records suggest that fees collected at caravanserais funded their maintenance, creating a cycle in which commerce paid for the very infrastructure that sustained it. In times of prosperity, inns also facilitated cultural transmission. Recipes, for example, traveled as readily as silks and spices. A Persian cook might learn to prepare noodles from a Chinese traveler, while a Turkic herder introduced fermented maize milk to merchants from the West. Spices blended into new combinations, and methods of preserving food, salting fish, drying fruits, fermenting vegetables, spread across the continent. To dine in a caravanserai was unknowingly to participate in the slow weaving of global cuisine. Even entertainment carried echoes of exchange. Storytellers from Central Asia brought epics that blended local folklore with themes borrowed from India or Persia. Music, too, traveled on the strings of lutes, the beats of drums, and the voices of wandering performers. In a courtyard lit by oil lamps, a merchant could listen to a melody that had journeyed across mountains and deserts, altered slightly at each stop, but still recognizable as it passed from one culture to another. Prosperity, then, transformed the forgotten inns into vibrant nodes of connection. They were not only places of rest, but also theatres of negotiation, classrooms of language, kitchens of fusion, and stages of performance. Their walls echoed with the hum of empire and commerce. But prosperity was not permanent. The very roads that carried abundance could also carry armies, plagues, and instability. Caravanserais that once rang with laughter and trade could quickly become sites of fear, abandoned when travel became too dangerous. Which raises the next question. What became of these inns in times of decline, when empires weakened, trade faltered, and the once busy courtyards grew silent? When prosperity ebbed along the Silk Roads, the caravanserais that had once flourished as bustling crossroads of exchange found themselves hollowed by silence. Decline did not arrive all at once. Rather, it crept in gradually, carried by war, shifting trade routes, and the slow decay of empires. The very features that made these inns indispensable, their reliance on travellers, their connection to distant markets, and their dependence on state support, also made them vulnerable. Political instability was one of the most immediate threats. Empires rose and fell across Central Asia, and each new dynasty brought its own policies toward trade. Some rulers invested in caravanserais, understanding that taxes on commerce enriched their treasuries. Others neglected or even destroyed them, seeing foreign merchants as threats rather than assets. When bandits and raiders gained the upper hand, inns became fortresses of fear, their gates closing earlier each evening, their guards more suspicious of strangers. As maritime trade routes expanded during the later medieval period, fewer caravans chose the long, dangerous overland journey. Ships could carry larger volumes of silk, spices, and porcelain more quickly than camel trains. Slowly, caravanserais lost their steady stream of merchants. Without the clamour of hooves and voices, the courtyards grew quiet. Food stores dwindled, cooks left in search of better work, watchmen deserted their posts. Even the animals that once filled the stables disappeared, leaving behind the smell of dust and decay. Disease also played a part. The Black Death, which spread along the Silk Roads in the 14th century, devastated communities and made long-distance travel perilous. Inns that once sheltered wary traders instead became feared as possible breeding grounds for infection. Records suggest that some caravanserais stood abandoned for years during outbreaks, their gates locked, their wells stagnant, and their courtyards overtaken by weeds. The architecture of the caravanserais, though built to last, began to crumble without maintenance. Roofs collapsed under the weight of snow or the heat of relentless sun. Stone walls eroded, inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of wind. Wells dried up, and cisterns cracked. Travelers who once trusted these structures to provide safety found, instead, roofless ruins unsuitable for shelter. In some places, locals scavenged stones from abandoned inns to build homes or repair city walls, leaving only fragments behind. For the communities that surrounded caravanserais, decline was more than an inconvenience. Inns had supported local economies, farmers sold grain to feed the caravans, herders supplied meat and dairy, artisans crafted saddles, tools, and pots for sale. When the inns emptied, these networks collapsed. Villages shrank or vanished altogether, unable to survive without the passing tide of commerce. A deserted caravanserai was not just a ruin, it was a monument to economic collapse, a marker of livelihoods lost. Yet even in decline, the inns were not entirely forgotten. Some transformed into local gathering spots, their vast courtyards repurposed as markets for nearby villages. Others served as way stations for armies rather than traders, housing soldiers instead of merchants. In rare cases, religious groups adopted abandoned inns, converting them into monasteries, shrines, or schools. What had once been a place of commerce became, instead, a place of devotion or learning. Travelers who passed through in later centuries often remarked on the eerie beauty of these decaying structures. A 17th century visitor might find a caravanserai still standing amid desolation, its arches intact but its rooms empty, its echo carrying only the wind. Standing within the courtyard, One could imagine the bustle that once filled the space, camels kneeling, merchants bargaining, fires flickering at night. The contrast between past vitality and present emptiness must have been striking. In some cases, ruins served as silent guides. Even when trade had shifted, travelers still used the skeletons of caravanserais to navigate across harsh landscapes. A crumbling inn might mark the distance between water sources or signal the location of a half-forgotten path. Long after their original function had ceased, these inns continued to shape the geography of memory and movement. The decline of the caravanserais mirrors a broader truth about history. Infrastructure rises and falls with the currents of human need. What once seemed permanent, a network of strongholds across continents, proved vulnerable to the shifting winds of trade and power. The inns remind us that history is not only written in the flourishing of civilizations, but also in their absences, their silences, their ruins. Today, archaeologists and historians trace these forgotten inns, uncovering fragments of pottery, inscriptions, and collapsed walls. In some places, restoration efforts have revived a few caravanserais as cultural heritage sites, allowing modern visitors to glimpse the grandeur of a world long past. Yet for most, their stories linger only in crumbling walls scattered across deserts and steppes. One cannot help but wonder, standing before the remnants of a caravanserai, if these walls could speak, what tales of merchants, monks, and soldiers would they tell? And in our own time, what structures of commerce and connection, airports, shipping ports, or digital networks, will someday stand abandoned, their bustling voices replaced by silence, their purpose remembered only through ruins? Tudor England, stretching from the late 15th century into the early 17th, was a world preoccupied with discipline. Order, hierarchy, and obedience shaped nearly every aspect of society, from court politics to the humblest village life. Nowhere was this more evident than in the schools of the period, where education was inseparable from punishment. To study the daily lives of Tudor schoolboys is to study not only their lessons, but also the peculiar systems of correction that governed them. A Tudor schoolroom was often a single, austere chamber, sparsely furnished, cold in winter and dim even on bright days. The air smelled of ink, parchment, and wax. Boys sat on wooden benches or stools, sometimes without backs, their slates balanced precariously as they copied Latin declensions or memorized scripture. The schoolmaster, often a man of stern reputation, presided with a rod or birch switch in hand. His presence carried both intellectual authority and the constant threat of physical discipline. Corporal punishment was the foundation of Tudor pedagogy. The belief that knowledge entered more firmly when accompanied by pain was widely accepted. The birch, long rods of twigs bound together, was the symbol of this philosophy. Boys could expect to be whipped across their bare backsides for errors in recitation, lapses in attention, or even for speaking out of turn. A slip in Latin grammar or failure to recall at psalm might earn swift retribution. The birch was often kept prominently displayed, not merely as a tool, but as a reminder that learning and suffering were intertwined. Punishments, however, extended beyond the birch. One common method was the use of the dunce cap. Though later associated with comic imagery, in Tudor times it was a genuine instrument of shame. A pointed cap, sometimes marked with humiliating words or symbols, was placed on the head of the boy who failed to learn quickly enough. He might be made to stand in the corner of the room, visible to all, the object of mockery by his peers. The intent was not only to correct, but to create an enduring memory of humiliation that would deter further mistakes. Other punishments were strangely creative. Some masters forced boys to kneel for hours on hard surfaces, such as stone or peas scattered on the floor, a torment both painful and tedious. Others required students to hold heavy books at arm's length, their muscles trembling until fatigue forced collapse, which often resulted in further beatings. Writing lines, a punishment still familiar centuries later, was practiced in Tudor schools, though usually not with paper and ink, which were costly. Instead, boys repeated phrases on slates or even scratched them into sand or wax tablets. The punishments could also be communal. If one boy misbehaved, The entire class might be disciplined, an approach designed to enforce peer pressure and mutual surveillance. In some schools, senior boys acted as monitors, granted authority to strike younger pupils for perceived infractions. This delegation of punishment created a hierarchy within the student body itself, reinforcing the values of authority and submission. While harsh by modern standards, these punishments reflected broader Tudor attitudes toward childhood. Children were often seen not as innocents to be nurtured, but as wayward beings whose wills needed breaking in order to prepare them for obedience to God, family, and crown. Schoolmasters justified their severity with scripture, pointing to verses that proclaimed, "Spare the rod and spoil the child." Discipline was framed as a moral duty, essential not only for education but for salvation. Despite the harshness, there was variation. Some schools and masters were more lenient, favoring encouragement over cruelty. Others moderated punishments with ceremony, announcing them formally, almost ritually, before delivering blows. But in nearly all Tudor schools, punishment was considered an ordinary, expected part of daily life, woven into the rhythm of lessons. For boys, to be a student was to live under constant vigilance, where a mistake in grammar could sting as sharply as a failure in conduct. What stands out today is not merely the severity, but the peculiar inventiveness of these punishments, each designed to mark the body or mind with the memory of discipline. A Tudor boy might return home at the end of the day with welts across his skin, sore knees, ink, stained hands, or the lingering shame of mockery. All reminders that education was as much about endurance as it was about learning. And yet, this system raises a question: if boys were taught more through fear than curiosity, did such punishments truly foster learning? Or did they simply teach obedience? If the first impression of Tudor schooling is one of harsh discipline, the second is an understanding of how punishment shaped the culture of learning itself. For the Tudor schoolboy, every moment of study carried the shadow of potential correction. Lessons in Latin, scripture, or rhetoric were never separated from the anticipation of pain or shame. This dynamic created a peculiar environment where knowledge and punishment seemed inseparable, and the memory of learning was often fused with the sting of the birch, or the echo of laughter directed at the dunce. The Tudor educational system was heavily centered on Latin. To read and write fluently in the language of the church, law, and diplomacy was the gateway to advancement. But for young boys, mastering complex conjugations and declensions was an exhausting process. Mistakes were inevitable, and punishment followed closely behind. The birch was not only a correction, but was seen as a reinforcement. Masters believed that a whipping at the moment of error would imprint the correct lesson on the mind. Thus, the boy who stumbled on a Latin verb might find himself whipped until his voice broke, with both recitation and sobs, after which he was expected to resume learning as if nothing had occurred. The culture of fear could create strange results. Some boys learned to avoid mistakes not through deeper understanding, but through hypervigilance, developing habits of rote memorization or mechanical repetition. Others grew adept at watching the master's temper, carefully adjusting their behavior to avoid provoking punishment. The schoolroom became less a space of intellectual exploration and more a stage where boys performed obedience, aware that every slip of the tongue or hesitation in recitation might bring swift pain. Yet punishment was not always physical. Shame, too, was a constant companion. To be placed in the dunce's cap was to be exposed before one's peers, marked as foolish. For a Tudor boy, whose future reputation depended on learning, this could be as cutting as the whip. Public shaming in the classroom often spilled into the playground and beyond, branding the child as slow or incompetent. Sometimes the cap was paired with verses written across the boy's chest or back, so that humiliation followed him even after lessons ended. Such punishments reveal how deeply Tudor society valued not only obedience but public reputation. Another curious form of discipline involved silence. A boy might be ordered to sit with a wooden token in his mouth, or with a board hung around his neck declaring his fault, forbidding him to speak. Others were compelled to stand for long hours without moving, their stillness itself a punishment. These methods, while less violent than flogging, could be equally exhausting, forcing boys into postures of discomfort until they collapsed in fatigue or tears. What complicates our view is that these punishments were not hidden or condemned by society. They were expected, and in many cases praised. Parents often supported the severity, believing that strict discipline was the only path to moral and intellectual growth. Letters from the period show fathers urging masters not to spare their sons, insisting that pain in youth would yield obedience and diligence in adulthood. The schoolroom thus became an extension of the Tudor household, where authority was absolute and correction unavoidable. There were, however, limits. Masters who punished excessively or with cruelty beyond custom sometimes faced criticism, though rarely formal censure. Communities valued discipline, but they also valued results. A boy broken by punishment to the point of despair or illness was of little use. Balance, in the Tudor view, was key. The rod was necessary, but it was to be wielded with judgment, not indulgence. Still, judgment was subjective, and what one master considered appropriate might appear brutal to another. In certain prestigious schools, punishments even became ritualized. Some were delivered in public ceremonies, with the entire student body assembled to witness the discipline. The offender might be stripped, whipped, and then made to recite prayers, the punishment framed as both moral correction and theatrical warning. Such events blurred the line between education and spectacle, embedding the memory of discipline not just in the punished boy, but in the entire school. It is striking to imagine the endurance required of Tudor schoolboys. A child of 7 or 8 might already face such ordeals, expected to sit still for hours, commit endless passages of scripture and Latin to memory, and brace himself for punishment should his mind falter. The lessons were long, the days repetitive, and the schoolroom offered little comfort. Even the physical environment reinforced severity. Cold stone floors, narrow windows, and stark wooden furniture left no room for distraction or ease. And yet, the system persisted because it produced results, at least in the eyes of the Tudor world. Boys who endured these punishments often went on to university, to positions in law, the church, or government. Discipline was believed to form character, and harsh schooling was framed as a necessary preparation for the even harsher demands of adult life. Whether the punishment truly educated or merely conditioned obedience is a question that lingers. Still, one cannot help but wonder, did these peculiar punishments cultivate genuine learning, or did they merely instill fear strong enough to mimic it? If we have traced the punishments of Tudor schoolboys through their pain and spectacle, we must now follow their consequences. What happened to the boys who grew up under this regime of fear and correction? Did the whip and the cap truly shape disciplined men, or did they leave quieter scars, folded away into adulthood? The Tudor age believed deeply in the transformative power of punishment. To be beaten was to be improved. To be shamed was to be instructed. From the perspective of the schoolmaster, no boy left his seat worse for a whipping, only wiser, more obedient, and more attentive. But when we search the records left by the boys themselves, a more complex picture emerges. Some who later wrote of their schooling described it with resentment, recalling masters who seemed more interested in cruelty than in learning. The poet John Milton, though a child of the slightly later Stuart period, reflected on the endless drills and punishments that defined his early education, lamenting how little true curiosity they inspired. Others, like Roger Ascham, tutor to Queen Elizabeth I, condemned the excessive use of the rod, arguing that gentleness and encouragement did far more to instill love of learning. Ascham even proposed that boys taught with kindness would learn faster, for they would approach their books without dread. Yet the majority of Tudor boys did not have the luxury of such enlightened teaching. For them, punishment was unavoidable. Some adapted by developing resilience, accepting pain as part of daily life. Others became cunning, learning to evade punishment by copying work, bribing classmates, or avoiding notice. In this way, Tudor punishments not only shaped the character of boys, but also their strategies of survival. One striking outcome was the normalization of violence in education. Boys who had been flogged in school often carried the practice into adulthood, becoming fathers or teachers who saw no problem in passing down the same discipline. A cycle of pain, justified as tradition, ensured that each generation of Tudor children endured much the same. But the punishments also had subtler effects. Public shaming, for instance, reinforced a sense of hierarchy and comparison among boys. Those who wore the dunce's cap or stood silent under ridicule were often marked in the minds of their peers, shaping reputations that lasted far beyond the classroom. A clever boy, quick to recite and avoid correction, might carry his confidence into later life. A slower child, humiliated before others, might struggle with self-doubt long after the punishments had ended. This, perhaps, is one of the more peculiar legacies of Tudor schooling, the belief that character could be carved not only by words on a page, but by pain across the skin. Education was as much about enduring discipline as it was about mastering knowledge. Boys who could withstand both were deemed fit for higher study, while those who crumbled under the strain were often left behind. Over time, of course, critics grew louder. By the late Tudor and early Stuart periods, writers questioned whether the rod truly cultivated learning or simply crushed spirits. As Chimes the schoolmaster argued for a gentler path, though it was slow to take hold. The practice of whipping boys remained widespread well into the 17th and 18th centuries. Reform would come, but only much later, when a broader understanding of childhood and education began to shift attitudes toward discipline. For the Tudor schoolboy, however, the matter was simple. To survive school was to survive punishment. Every lesson was accompanied by its shadow, every memory of learning tinged with the recollection of fear. The peculiar punishments of this age, so ordinary in their time, now strike us as severe, even cruel. But in the minds of Tudor parents and masters, they were acts of care, rooted in the belief that pain taught obedience, and obedience opened the way to wisdom. And so we are left with a final question. When we remember these boys bent over their lessons, whispering Latin under the weight of fear, should we admire their endurance, or mourn what might have been lost in the silence of their suffering? In the long night along the Nile, where the desert air cooled after the day's burning sun, the question of sleep was never trivial. To us, the act of lying down seems natural, but for the people of ancient Egypt, even rest was framed by ritual necessity and the tools of daily life. The pillow, as we imagine it, soft, stuffed, and inviting, was unknown to them. Instead, they relied upon a curious device, the headrest, a carved stand of wood, ivory, or stone, designed not for comfort in the way we might understand it, but for support and symbolism. If you picture it, the object looks almost austere, a curved cradle resting atop a short column, balanced on a flat base. The head would rest on the curve, raising the skull slightly above the sleeping surface. To our eyes, this might appear rigid, even uncomfortable, yet it was the standard form across centuries. Archaeologists have found headrests in tombs dating back to the Old Kingdom, and their presence among the grave goods of both nobles and commoners suggests they were considered indispensable, not merely for nightly rest, but also for the eternal sleep of the afterlife. The material of these headrests varied. A wealthy family might commission one from alabaster, ivory, or polished hardwood, decorated with inscriptions or protective images. A poorer household might make do with a simple wooden block. Either way, the function remained the same: to support the sleeper's head and keep it raised. In the heat of Egypt, this design had practical benefits. Lifting the head improved airflow, cooling the body during hot nights. It also protected the sleeper from insects, as lifting the head kept sensitive areas like the ears and nose away from crawling pests. But beyond practicality, the Egyptians saw deeper meaning in this object. To them, the head was sacred, the seat of life and consciousness. Supporting it carefully was an act of reverence, not unlike how a temple might hold a sacred statue. The headdress became bound up in their spiritual view of sleep, death, and rebirth. Many examples bear carvings of the god Bes, the dwarf, like deity of protection, whose role was to guard sleepers from harm and ward off nightmares. Others depict Hathor or other deities associated with protection and renewal. We might wonder, did these people ever long for softness, for something closer to what we know as a pillow? There is little evidence to suggest so. Egyptian beds themselves were often wooden frames with woven reeds or leather strips forming the sleeping surface. Linen sheets, sometimes stuffed lightly with papyrus fibers, provided a degree of comfort. But softness was not the guiding principle. It was order, alignment, and symbolism. The head, resting on its support, became a visible expression of harmony between the body and the cosmic order. Nighttime itself carried significance in Egyptian thought. Sleep was considered a vulnerable state, one in which the soul might wander or encounter unseen forces. Spells and amulets were often used to ensure safe rest. Dreams, too, were taken seriously, recorded on papyrus, and sometimes interpreted as divine messages. In this way, the act of laying one's head upon the carved rest was not only physical, but spiritual, a moment of surrender to the mysteries of night. Yet, for all the reverence attached to it, we are left with a practical curiosity. How did it feel to sleep with one's skull balanced on a piece of wood or stone? Was it an act of resignation, a habit so ingrained that comfort no longer mattered? Or was there, perhaps, a subtle relief in the coolness of polished stone, in the certainty of a support that never wore out, never sagged, never lost its shape? And so, when the Egyptian sleeper closed their eyes, with the Nile flowing endlessly outside, and the desert winds whispering against mud, brick walls, did they dream differently because their head was raised high, supported not by softness, but by a carved stand that promised both rest and protection? To understand why the Egyptians clung so firmly to the headrest, we have to consider the wider framework of how they approached both daily life and the eternal life they believed followed. In their world, the boundary between the two was porous. Actions performed in the ordinary routine often echoed in the realm of eternity. A tool for sleeping, therefore, became more than just an accessory to comfort. It was a symbol of continuity, a bridge between night and the eternal night of the tomb. Excavations of tombs across the Nile Valley have revealed that the headrest was not just for the living. It was deliberately placed among the possessions of the dead, just as food, amulets, and figurines of servants were provided. Some examples bear inscriptions that link the headrest directly to rebirth. In certain funerary texts, the headrest is described as lifting the head of the deceased, allowing them to breathe again, to awaken into the afterlife. In this sense, the object carried with it the promise of resurrection. The dead, like the living, would rest their heads on the curved cradle, awaiting the dawn. This belief was reinforced through imagery. One common motif on headrests was the rising sun, or symbols of the horizon. To the Egyptians, sunrise was not merely a daily occurrence but a cosmic renewal. Just as the sun god Ra died each evening, descending into the underworld, and was reborn each morning, so too did humans experience sleep as a miniature death, followed by waking as a form of rebirth. The headrest, by elevating the head and keeping it stable, was thought to aid this cycle. In practical terms, the sleep of an Egyptian was not as we imagine it today. Their houses were built of mud brick, often with flat roofs. In the hottest months, families might climb a staircase to the roof to sleep under the stars, where the air was cooler. Beds themselves were not universal. Many poorer families simply slept on reed mats laid directly on the ground. For those who did own beds, the structure was usually slightly inclined, with legs taller at one end, raising the head. The headrest complemented this by ensuring proper support. When paired together, the slanted bed and the curved rest, an Egyptian sleeper would have their body angled just enough to breathe more freely in the heavy heat. For the wealthy, beds could be elaborate. Some were gilded, adorned with animal motifs, and equipped with woven linen sheets. Yet the headrest remained a constant across social divides. Its presence in both royal tombs and simple burials indicates a rare kind of universality. Even Tutankhamen's tomb contained exquisitely crafted examples made of ivory and decorated with protective deities. The message was clear. No matter one's station in life, the act of laying down the head was a sacred ritual. It is telling that the Egyptians never abandoned the headdress design, despite having access to linen, stuffing, and other materials that could have been fashioned into softer pillows. Their neighbors, such as the Mesopotamians, sometimes used cushions filled with reeds or straw. In contrast, Egyptian culture preserved the rigid form. This may be because comfort, as we interpret it, was not the highest priority. What mattered most was alignment with cosmic order and the protection of the body. Softness might even have been seen as weakness, a dangerous indulgence that left one vulnerable. In addition, there was a hygienic logic behind the headrest. By elevating the head, it kept the sleeper's hair free from contact with mats and bedding, reducing lice infestations and improving cleanliness. The cooling effect of stone or polished wood also helped with the intense heat of Egyptian nights. What appears to us as an uncomfortable solution may, in fact, have been an ingenious balance of necessity and symbolism. Still, we cannot help but imagine the sensation. The cool curve of ivory against the base of the skull, the gentle angle of the head held upright, the body stretched across woven reeds. Was this truly restful? Or was it a different kind of rest altogether, one shaped less by physical ease and more by the certainty of ritual? For the Egyptians, perhaps comfort came not from softness, but from the assurance that each night was protected, each dream guided, and each morning promised renewal. And if we accept this, we must ask, did the Egyptians think of sleep less as a private indulgence and more as a small rehearsal for death? One in which every detail, the headdress, the bed, the amulet by the bedside, was arranged to ensure safe passage through the night. Egyptian relationship with sleep brings us to the spiritual dimension, where the nightly act of closing one's eyes was bound with divine oversight and ritual precision. It was not enough to simply rest the body. The mind and soul required safeguards. The headdress, though simple in appearance, became an anchor for a larger network of beliefs that stretched into dreams, death, and protection. Among the artifacts left behind are charms and inscriptions that directly connect the headdress with warding off evil. In one funerary spell, the headdress is invoked as a weapon against demons of the night, granting the sleeper stability not only of posture, but also of spirit. The curved form, which kept the head upright, was thought to preserve vital energy and guard the vulnerable areas of the neck and face. For Egyptians, sleep was not a passive state. It was a crossing into a liminal space where the soul traveled, exposed to unseen dangers. Dreams themselves carried great significance. They were interpreted as messages from the gods, warnings, or glimpses into the hidden order of the world. A person who dreamed vividly might consult a priest, who could translate the vision using specialized manuals of dream interpretation. These manuals, preserved in fragments, list scenarios, such as eating certain foods, or encountering animals, or hearing particular sounds, and the corresponding meanings. To sleep well, therefore, was to prepare not only for physical restoration, but also for divine communication. In this sense, the headdress can be understood as a tool for dream management. By elevating the head, it may have encouraged a lighter, more watchful sleep, one in which dreams could be recalled and interpreted. The Egyptians saw no contradiction between discomfort and meaning. What mattered was that the dreamer was positioned correctly to receive messages, both from the gods and from the deeper self. This way of thinking persisted into death. Tomb scenes often depict the deceased lying on a bed, head supported by a rest, while nearby attendants or deities assist in their rebirth. In some coffins, small carved headdresses were placed beneath the sculpted head of the mummy itself, reinforcing the belief that the position of the head was crucial. To allow the head to droop or sag was unthinkable. It was to invite chaos and disorder into the delicate process of eternal renewal. It is striking to compare this with later cultures. In ancient Greece and Rome, cushions and bolsters became widespread, associated with luxury and indulgence. By contrast, Egyptian tradition held steady for centuries, valuing the symbolic function of the headdress over comfort. Even when trade brought new fabrics and ideas into the Nile Valley, the form endured. In this continuity, we see not stubbornness, but conviction. To abandon the headdress would have been to abandon a cosmological principle. That sleep is rehearsal for eternity, and the head must always be supported for the soul to rise again. We can imagine the daily ritual of an ordinary Egyptian. The household quiets as dusk spreads across the desert. A mat is laid, or a low bed is prepared. The sleeper settles down, adjusting their body to the woven reeds. Carefully, they place the back of their skull against the cool curve of wood or stone, feeling the firm surface cradle them. Around them, the sounds of insects hum through the night air, and the heavy scent of oil lamps drifts. Sleep comes not as a release into comfort, but as a passage into guarded stillness, watched over by gods, protected by form, directed by the headdress beneath them. This way of sleeping seems foreign to us, yet it raises questions about our own assumptions. Is comfort the ultimate aim of rest, or is it alignment, whether with health, with ritual, or with meaning? The Egyptians did not soften their nights with pillows, yet they gave their sleep an importance that extended beyond the body, reaching into eternity. And so we are left to wonder, in our modern pursuit of softness and ease, have we lost something of the reverence that the Egyptians held for the simple act of laying down the head at night? In the crowded streets of a medieval town, the apothecary's shop stood as a small, fragrant haven of remedies, dried herbs, and curious containers. To walk inside was to enter a world where the scent of rosemary mingled with the sharp tang of vinegar and the earthy smell of roots, long dried in the sun. The apothecary was more than a merchant. He was a custodian of health, a practitioner of early science, and a guide through the precarious balance between illness and survival. Apothecaries operated in a time when medicine was a mixture of observation, tradition, and superstition. Their shops were often cramped, with shelves stacked high with jars, wooden boxes, and earthenware pots labelled with inked symbols and abbreviated Latin terms. Some contained dried flowers and leaves, others housed powders and tinctures whose sources ranged from the mundane to the exotic. Cinnamon and cloves travelled hundreds of miles from far-off lands, while local herbs like sage, thyme, and yarrow were gathered from nearby fields. The daily routine of a medieval apothecary was methodical and exacting. Early in the morning, he would inspect his stock, noting which ingredients were fresh, which were contaminated by moisture or insects, and which had to be replaced. Certain herbs required careful storage. Lavender, for example, had to remain dry to preserve its fragrance and medicinal potency. Roots and barks were sometimes soaked or boiled, then crushed into powders for mixing. Each preparation demanded precision. A miscalculation could render a remedy useless, or worse, harmful. Customers came in for myriad reasons, some mundane, others dire. A mother might seek a soothing syrup for her coughing child. A farmer might want a salve for a cut sustained while tending sheep. A nobleman might request a potion to improve digestion or enhance vigor. The apothecary assessed symptoms carefully, relying on knowledge passed down from texts by Galen and Hippocrates, as well as local experience. Observation was key. The color of a tongue, the pulse at the wrist, or even the tone of a patient's voice could guide treatment. Some remedies were straightforward: herbal teas for colds, poultices for wounds, or honey to soothe a sore throat. Others were more elaborate. Tinctures combined multiple herbs with alcohol, sometimes mixed with animal products such as powdered bones or fat. Compounding these required a steady hand and knowledge of proportions, which were often recorded in recipes handed down from master to apprentice. Accuracy was a matter of life and death, and so apprentices were rigorously trained in measurement, grinding, and infusion. As the day progressed, the apothecary's work shifted from preparation to consultation. Townsfolk and travellers alike entered the shop, bringing a mix of ailments, anxieties, and expectations. Each customer required a delicate balance of attention, knowledge, and persuasion. The apothecary had to assess whether the malady could be treated with simple herbs, or if it required more complex preparations, and, importantly, whether he had the necessary ingredients on hand. Some ingredients were mundane and local: sage to calm a fever, mint to settle a stomach, or willow bark for pain relief. Others, however, came from distant lands, carried along trade routes that spanned continents. Cinnamon and cloves arrived from the Spice Islands, aloe from the deserts of Africa, and exotic resins from Arabia. Tracking their quality was a constant concern. Imported herbs could arrive damp, stale, or contaminated. The apothecary would inspect each carefully, rubbing leaves between his fingers, noting aroma and texture, sometimes consulting written notes from previous shipments to detect inconsistencies. One of the more fascinating aspects of the apothecary's life was the blending of medicine with ritual. Healing, in the medieval mind, was not purely chemical. It involved symbolism, invocation, and observation. Remedies were often infused with prayers or specific rituals, such as stirring a potion clockwise to ensure efficacy or reciting particular words while applying a salve. A simple preparation might include a phrase in Latin or a blessing intended to aid the herb's natural powers. The line between science and superstition was thin, yet each action was believed to make the difference between success and failure. Apothecaries also acted as early pharmacists in the modern sense, carefully measuring doses. Powders were often dispensed using scales that could detect differences as small as a fraction of a gram. Liquids were measured with graduated vessels, and ointments with wooden spatulas. Apprentices learned quickly that errors could have serious consequences. A dose too strong could sicken a patient. A dose too weak might render the remedy useless. Apprentices often spent years perfecting the tactile sense required to grind, mix, and measure without faltering. Business extended beyond the shop as well. Some apothecaries traveled to the countryside to gather fresh herbs, particularly those that lost potency if dried or stored too long. Trips into fields, meadows, and riverbanks were part of the job, and the knowledge of seasons, soil, and local flora became as critical as any book of recipes. They learned which plants retained their healing qualities and how to store them for winter months. This connection to nature gave the apothecary a dual role: part healer, part herbalist, part naturalist, observing the cycles of growth and decay that governed life itself. Socially, the apothecary occupied an interesting position. He was respected but not elite. His services were essential, but his income could fluctuate with the seasons and the prevalence of disease. During outbreaks, demand skyrocketed, and the shop became a hub of activity and anxiety. Families would arrive seeking remedies for fevers, coughs, or digestive complaints. At such times, the apothecary had to manage not only preparation, but also the emotions of worried clients. His ability to project calm, knowledge, and authority was almost as important as the remedies themselves. Guilds provided both protection and oversight. Membership ensured access to rare ingredients, guidance on preparation methods, and legal recourse against fraud or malpractice. However, it also imposed strict regulations. Apprenticeships lasted years, during which the young worker learned not only the craft, but also the ethics of the profession, how to assess customers, record transactions, and avoid dangerous errors. Guilds also controlled pricing, preventing unscrupulous merchants from undercutting or overcharging. In many ways, the guild system shaped the profession as much as the knowledge of herbs and medicine did. Despite the seriousness of the work, moments of quiet humor and human interaction punctuated the day. A boy fetching water might stumble, spilling ingredients in an aromatic chaos. A nervous mother might hesitate while holding her child's hand, giving the apothecary a chance to reassure her with patience. The rhythm of daily life alternated between precision, observation, and human unpredictability. And yet, for all the order and skill, one question lingered in the background. In a world where disease often outpaced remedies, and chance governed recovery as much as preparation, how often did the apothecary's craft truly save a life? And how often did the patient recover despite his efforts? As the evening descended on the town, the apothecary's day wound down, but the work was never entirely over. Preparations made during the morning might require settling, infusions steeping overnight, or mixtures left to cool. The quiet of the shop after the bustling day brought time for reflection, record-keeping, and planning. Every jar and container had to be accounted for, recipes copied or adjusted, and notes on patients' progress carefully recorded. Accuracy was paramount. Even a small oversight could affect the next day's treatments. This was also a time for apprentices to review their lessons, practicing measurements, grinding herbs, or preparing small doses under the watchful eye of the master. These hours of repetition, though monotonous, were the foundation of expertise. The craft required both patience and precision. Grinding a root to the correct consistency, balancing powders to the exact fraction, and timing the infusion of herbs were not skills learned in haste. Each action carried weight, because in the medieval mind, errors were not just practical, they could be matters of life and death. Beyond the physical work, the apothecary's evening often involved consulting texts. Scrolls and codices, sometimes centuries old, contained instructions, dosages, and observations that guided daily practice. The written word provided continuity across generations. Recipes were tested, modified, and passed down. Some texts included obscure remedies that bordered on superstition, such as potions incorporating animal parts, rare resins, or mineral compounds. The apothecary had to navigate the fine line between inherited wisdom and practical efficacy, balancing tradition with observation. Socially, the apothecary's role extended beyond medicine. In small towns, he was a hub of knowledge. News from travelers, trade, routes, and distant cities often passed through the shop, along with medical information. He might advise a neighbor on crop, related illnesses in livestock, discuss the preservation of herbs, or even interpret omens associated with health and disease. The apothecary, in essence, functioned as a nexus between practical medicine, natural observation, and communal wisdom. Night also brought reflection on limitations. Despite his skill and knowledge, the apothecary lived with uncertainty. Disease was pervasive, and the causes often misunderstood. Plagues, fevers, and infections could strike without warning. Even well-prepared remedies sometimes failed, reminding the apothecary that survival depended not only on craft, but also on fortune and resilience. His daily toil was meaningful but imperfect. Success was measured not in guarantees, but in the delicate sway between recovery and continued illness. The lasting impact of medieval apothecaries is evident in their blend of empirical observation and practical care. They laid the groundwork for modern pharmacy by recording formulas, standardizing doses, and refining preparations. Their work bridged the gap between folk remedies and professional medicine, introducing a system of organized, repeatable care in a world where chaos often governed health. Yet, at the heart of their practice remained the simple human connection, the attentive listener, the hand guiding an anxious mother, the quiet presence tending to someone's pain. In the end, the medieval apothecary's world was one of slow rhythm and careful labor, where patience, observation, and precision were more valuable than speed or extravagance. It was a life dominated by details, from the grinding of roots to the documentation of recipes, from the monitoring of patients' symptoms to the preparation of complex tinctures. The work may have seemed monotonous, even boring at times, yet it was vital. It shaped the health and resilience of entire communities, even in an age of uncertainty. And so, we are left to ponder in a world where science was nascent, medicine entwined with ritual, and outcomes uncertain. Was the apothecary's greatest achievement the cures he administered, or the structure, order, and knowledge he preserved for generations to come?